What if I told you that one of Europe's most powerful kings lived a life so scandalous, even his official portraits tried to hide it? Ferdinand VII of Spain wasn't just cruel. He was obsessed with domination in war, in politics, and especially in the bedroom. He ruled twice, lost his crown twice, brought back the Inquisition, and believed his body belonged to God. But everyone else's body belonged to him. This isn't just the story of a bad monarch. It's a descent into obsession, humiliation, and rot beneath the crown. Because when history writes about kings, it often skips the bedroom. But with Ferdinand, that's where the monarchy truly lived. Ferdinand was born in 1784, into the Spanish Bourbon dynasty, a family obsessed with bloodlines and public virtue. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, reportedly despised him, while rumors swirled that he wasn't even hers. His father, King Charles IV, was more interested in hunting than ruling, or raising a son. So Ferdinand grew up cold, withdrawn, cruel to animals, obsessed with power, and quick to punish anyone who crossed him. By 6, he slapped a servant for looking him in the eye. By 10, he was already writing secret letters to remove the Queen's lover. That lover was Manuel Godoy, Spain's real power broker. Ferdinand hated him with a venom usually reserved for enemies of the state. At 13, Ferdinand tried to orchestrate a court coup. It failed, and he was locked away in velvet-draped luxury to think about it. But he didn't stop scheming. He studied Machiavelli, memorized torture manuals, and practiced smiling in mirrors to lie more convincingly. By the time he was 24, the people saw him as a savior, promising reform, morality, and liberation from corruption. They cheered him through the streets of Madrid, showered him with flowers, and called him El Decido, the desired one. But Ferdinand was a mask, and behind that mask was a coward, a manipulator, and a man who would sell out his country in days. In 1808, Napoleon invited Ferdinand to a peace talk in Madrid, and the king, flattered and naive, went willingly. He dined, smiled, and signed documents that made him abdicate, giving Napoleon Spain without a single shot fired. While Spaniards bled in the Peninsular War, Ferdinand lounged in a French chateau, sipping wine and sketching erotica. Yes, real historians uncovered dozens of pornographic drawings he made in exile, some starring nuns, labeled Santa Maria. He didn't sketch battle plans or political reforms. He sketched women bound, bent, and punished, always with him watching from the shadows. And when Napoleon finally lost the war, the people still welcomed Ferdinand back, desperate for a return to order. They thought exile had changed him. Instead, it refined his cruelty and sharpened his appetite for control. In 1814, his first act was to abolish the liberal Constitution of 1812 and declare himself absolute monarch. He brought back the Inquisition, censored newspapers, outlawed free speech, and tortured anyone who questioned his rule. Books burned, journalists vanished, and Spain became a kingdom of whispers and fear. He was called the King of Cotton Wool. Soft in public, venomous in private. He kissed babies on balconies, then signed torture orders at midnight. But nowhere did his obsessions run deeper than inside the palace walls, particularly in the royal bedroom. He married 4 times, each bride younger than the last, and each union stranger and more tragic than the one before. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, was 17 and terrified of him. She died childless after years of illness and anxiety. Ferdinand blamed her womb, not his behavior, and moved on to the next girl. And then another. His third wife was forced to track her ovulation in journals, timed to the minute by royal astrologers. He constructed a fertility chamber lined in red velvet where priests and mystics would decide when sex might succeed. An ambassador once called the royal court a gynecological experiment disguised as a monarchy. Yet every marriage failed to produce a son, until his fourth wife, Maria Cristina, gave birth to a daughter. Ferdinand was furious, but he changed Spanish law to let her inherit, determined that his bloodline would reign, even if through a girl. 2 months later, he died, leaving behind a scandalized court, a fractured nation, and a legacy that would tear Spain apart. When Ferdinand died in 1833, he left behind more than a grieving widow. He left behind a legal bomb. He had changed the succession laws in secret to allow his daughter Isabella II to inherit the crown. But many nobles refused to accept a woman as monarch, especially when Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, claimed he was the rightful heir. The result? A bloody civil war known as the Carlist Wars. Decades of chaos ignited by one man's obsession with controlling the future. Ferdinand didn't just leave behind a dynasty. He left behind a curse. His daughter ascended the throne at age 3 and grew up surrounded by paranoia, backstabbing, and religious fanaticism. Isabella II's reign was a chaotic echo of her father's, marked by scandal, coups, and whispers of affairs behind palace curtains. In many ways, Ferdinand didn't die. His twisted legacy kept ruling through the very chaos he caused. Historians debate whether he was simply inept or dangerously deluded, but few denied the damage he inflicted on Spain. In his later years, Ferdinand's health began to fail, yet his obsession with sex and succession only grew stronger. He suffered from gout, obesity, and what some doctors called nervous tremors of the mind. But he still insisted on nightly visits to Maria Christina's bedchamber, even when she was heavily pregnant and exhausted. When servants complained about the king's nocturnal demands, they were dismissed, beaten, or disappeared. Inside the palace, he had a special wing sealed off for recovery, filled with incense, velvet beds, and forbidden tapestries. Visitors were rarely allowed in, but those who did described strange rituals involving candles, charts, and whispered chants. One French ambassador wrote that it felt less like a royal court than a cult built around a single man's desires. And perhaps that was the point. Ferdinand didn't just want to be king. He wanted to be worshipped. He surrounded himself with flatterers, mystics, and quack doctors who fed his paranoia and told him what he wanted to hear. If a physician suggested rest, another would promise him virility potions brewed from bulls. When he couldn't produce a male heir, he blamed fate, God, his enemies, never himself. In one letter, he wrote, "The throne shall not rot beneath a woman. My name shall echo through her womb." But fate, as always, had the last word, and his only child would inherit a shattered empire. Spain at that time was a kingdom of ghosts. Its gold spent, its armies weakened, its people divided. Ferdinand's need to control every inch of his world had hollowed it out, leaving behind fear and fury. And yet, the people still hung his portrait in their homes. Why? Because despite his crimes, Ferdinand had become a symbol, not of strength, but of punishment. He was what happens when monarchy turns inward, when power becomes a mirror that reflects only desire. Even his personal guards, the halberdiers, wrote in journals about the king's strange midnight walks through the halls. One wrote, "He walked as if haunted, barefoot, whispering names none of us knew." Another claimed Ferdinand once ordered a gold crucifix to be buried beneath his bed to ward off the sterile spirits. It wasn't just eccentricity, it was fear made flesh. He feared that history would forget him. So he crafted a kingdom in his own image, twisted, secretive, seductive, and broken. And in doing so, he ensured that Spain would bleed long after he stopped breathing. Modern historians now refer to his rule as the Velvet Nightmare. Beautiful on the outside, decaying within. His surviving letters reveal a man obsessed with purity, but addicted to corruption. He preached Catholic virtue, while commissioning paintings that would make courtesans blush. He spoke of divine order, yet ordered tortures that defied the very scriptures he cited. There are rumors, never confirmed, but widely believed, that he had a hidden chamber of mirrors beneath the palace. Inside, he would supposedly stand naked, reciting prayers while watching himself from every angle. Was it vanity? Was it madness? Or was it a man trying to see a soul he no longer recognized? One maid described him weeping after an astrologer told him he would never sire a son. She said he slapped the stars from the chart, then collapsed into a chair whispering, "Then I am no king." It was never about ruling. It was about legacy, about imprinting himself on time. And when he couldn't do that with a son, he tried to do it through control, fear, and spectacle. Every edict, every marriage, every night spent with incense and velvet. It was all part of a desperate campaign to be remembered, even if only as a monster. And, in that, at least, he succeeded. By the 1830s, Ferdinand had turned the Spanish court into a strange mix of ritual and repression, a place where ministers feared eye contact and queens feared fertility. Palace musicians were forbidden from playing love songs unless directly commanded by the king, and when they disobeyed, their instruments were burned in the courtyard. When one court painter refused to finish a portrait of the queen's belly, Ferdinand ordered him sent to a monastery to learn humility. Nothing inside the palace escaped his paranoia. Not the food, not the furniture, not even the lighting. He believed darkness invited betrayal, so corridors were overlit with candles, even at night, making shadows jump like ghosts against the walls. He installed confessionals inside royal bedrooms, convinced that sin could be bled out through words if caught quickly enough. When Maria Christina miscarried during her second pregnancy, Ferdinand reportedly ordered a priest to exorcise the entire chamber. No one was allowed to speak of failure. Not illness, not infertility, not disobedience. All were considered forms of treason. A stable boy once joked that the king's horses were more fertile than the queen. He was never seen again. Even the queen's midwife was replaced twice in 1 year for poor spiritual energy, though she claimed it was because she wouldn't lie about blood on the sheets. Outside the palace, the people were starving, but Ferdinand ordered fresh exotic fruits flown in daily from the Canary Islands for his digestive balance. He once spent 200,000 reales to build a private observatory, not for science, but so astrologers could better time his intercourse. The stars, he believed, were more trustworthy than doctors or wives. And yet he feared those stars too, asking his astrologers to chart not just his future, but his enemies' deaths. He wanted to know when they would suffer, when they would fail, when they would disappear. Power for Ferdinand wasn't something you wielded. It was something you swallowed. And the more he consumed, the more hollow he became. In his later years, Ferdinand rarely left the palace. Some say not out of laziness, but fear of being poisoned by his own people. He had food tasters, water testers, scent inspectors, even a priest who blessed his shaving razors. Despite this, he grew increasingly sick, bloated, and constipated, his body rebelling against its own rituals. A visiting French envoy wrote, "The king has become a temple to his own paranoia. Every breath, a prayer of fear." And it was in this crumbling state that Ferdinand became most obsessed with preserving his image. He commissioned over 30 official portraits in the final 2 years of his life, each carefully staged to hide his decaying health. In them, his eyes looked sharp, his hands firm, his back straight. But in truth, he was barely walking. One servant said the king wore corsets tighter than any womanist just to stay upright for the paintings. And when he could no longer stand, he ordered a replica throne be brought to his bedchamber so he could be painted sitting in authority. The man who once strutted through marble halls now lay in silk sheets, asking to be drawn as a god. His final days were spent surrounded by mirrors, incense, and silence. He refused all visitors, except his confessor, a mute monk who sat beside him without speaking. He died on September 29, 1833. Bloated, breathless, and still convinced that only he could save Spain. But his legacy was already unraveling. The Carlist Wars exploded almost instantly. Don Carlos versus Queen Isabella. Tradition versus reform. Blood against blood. And at the center of it all lay Ferdinand's ghost, haunting every law, every battle, every whisper of betrayal. His daughter, Isabella II, would reign, but her throne shook from day one, cursed by the sins of her father. Rumors swirled that her own ministers feared touching the crown he once wore, as if madness could be transferred like a disease. Spain entered an age of uncertainty, not because of war, but because no one could agree what truth even looked like anymore. Ferdinand's reign had replaced honesty with fear, and after his death, that fear didn't fade. Even poets refused to write odes about him, claiming their pens bent away from the ink. A cathedral in Seville refused to ring its bells for his funeral, calling him an emperor of flesh, not of faith. His tomb was visited more out of curiosity than reverence, a monument to scandal more than sovereignty. And still, some whispered that he would rise again. Not from the grave, but in the hearts of every ruler who confused control with greatness. In the decades that followed, Ferdinand became a cautionary tale whispered in royal corridors. Not for his failures in politics, but for the rot he brought behind closed doors. Future monarchs were warned not to repeat his errors of obsession, yet many secretly studied his methods with morbid curiosity. They wanted to understand how a man so weak had held such absolute control. Not through love, not through legacy, but through fear so intimate it left claw marks on the walls. Letters found years later revealed Ferdinand kept a private blacklist, not of generals or spies, but of former servants who knew too much about the royal bed. Some were paid off. Others vanished without explanation. A few were found floating in the Tagus River, their mouths filled with rose petals. He believed in omens, signs, and rituals more than reason, especially when it came to matters of the body. It is said he once refused to consummate a marriage, until a dove flew through his window as a sign of divine approval. When no dove appeared, he released one from a cage himself, then called it fate. That moment wasn't rare. It was how Ferdinand ruled, by scripting miracles to justify indulgence. Even his coronation had been choreographed like theater. Incense pumped beneath the crowd, bells timed with heartbeat precision. Power, to him, wasn't about truth. It was about belief. And belief, when twisted, can justify anything. That's how Ferdinand could ban abortion while forcing miscarried queens to pose for fertility portraits. How he could burn immoral literature while privately funding erotic artists. How he could kiss the Pope's ring and, in the same week, choke a mistress for speaking out of turn. His contradictions weren't accidental. They were his design. Because confusion is a form of control. If no one knows who you really are, they fear who you might become. And fear, Ferdinand learned early, is the most faithful subject a king can keep. In one surviving diary entry, he wrote, "A loyal man may change his mind." He weaponized morality, used virtue like a dagger. Always sharp, always turned outward. Even the church couldn't contain him. When one archbishop dared question his fourth marriage, Ferdinand had the man reassigned to a monastery in the Pyrenees, without food for 3 days. When monks at El Escorial tried to hold a vigil for his soul after his death, a fire broke out in the chapel. Some said it was lightning. Others said it was divine rejection. No monarch since has had a funeral so quiet, yet so loud in its legacy. And that's the paradox of Ferdinand VII. His name inspires no songs, no parades. But it lingers. He is the shadow behind royal portraits, the echo in every scandal the crown tries to suppress. His reign was a tragedy not just for Spain, but for the idea of kingship itself, because he proved that a throne doesn't need wisdom or courage. It only needs hunger. And Ferdinand was never full, not of power, not of punishment. He consumed his court, his people, his wives, and in the end, even himself. Some scholars now refer to his reign as the cannibal crown, a kingdom that devoured its own sanity. He left behind libraries emptied of truth and palaces filled with superstition. One room in the royal palace of Madrid. Tour guides don't mention it, but guards know the stories. They leave the candles unlit. They keep the doors locked. And some say if you stand outside it long enough, you can hear faint whispers. Counting. Counting days. Counting wives. Counting sins. Because some legacies don't rest in history books. They haunt the walls. Ferdinand VII wanted to be remembered. He didn't care if it was for greatness or for growth. And now, centuries later, he has what he wanted. His name is still spoken. Not in reverence, but in recoil. Not as a monarch, but as a warning. A lesson carved in velvet and blood. A ghost with a crown, still watching. Centuries later, Ferdinand's reign feels less like royal history and more like a fever dream. A monarch so consumed by paranoia and desire. His sins outlived his laws. He left no golden age, no grand reform, only shadows and scandals. While other kings are remembered with statues and songs, Ferdinand survives in whispers, sealed doors, and stained pages too obscene for the archives. Historians still argue what he truly was. A madman lost in ritual, a calculating sadist who manipulated symbols, or a lonely child with a crown and no soul to guide him. He didn't govern an empire. He choreographed a spectacle, filled with incense, fear, and velvet-soaked silence. Every decree he signed was another stage direction in his personal theater of control. Every bedroom he violated, every law he twisted, served only one goal: to be remembered. He feared irrelevance more than death, impotence more than defeat. And so he fed himself power until it rotted the very throne beneath him. His rituals became obsession. From fertility charts to exorcised bed, from astrologer-approved intercourse to punishments disguised as virtue. Even in death, he clung to performance, commissioning portraits that hid his bloated form, staged in stiff robes and painted authority. Too sick to stand, he posed on a faux throne in his bedchamber. The illusion of power painted over the collapse of a man. He died on September 29, 1833. Breathless, swollen, and still believing he was Spain's savior. But the war he started outlived him. The Carlist Wars erupted instantly, not over policy, but over lineage, gender, and one man's obsession with controlling his bloodline from the grave. Spain split in two, between those who followed his daughter and those who followed his brother. And Ferdinand's name was the ghost behind every shot fired. His daughter, Isabella II, inherited a throne poisoned by paranoia and scandal, and from the moment she sat on it, it began to tremble. Ministers hesitated to wear his crown. Priests refused to bless his seal, as if his madness had soaked into the very fabric of monarchy. Tourists still visit the royal palace in Madrid, but there are corridors left, unexplained. Doors marked for restoration. Guards stationed silently nearby. Some say behind them lie velvet-lined rooms filled with sealed journals, strange relics, or rituals never meant for daylight. A whisper says one room still holds a mirror. The one where Ferdinand prayed to himself in candlelight, asking to be remembered. He wasn't loved, he wasn't admired, but he was feared, and in his mind, that was immortality. No cathedrals ring for his birth. But when monarchs speak of control, they trace the edges of his crown. He turned monarchy into myth, power into spectacle, and sin into statecraft, an empire of velvet, blood, and silence. One modern historian called him the warning at the end of the lineage. The king who proved that legacy can be built on fear alone. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing about Ferdinand VII. Not that he ruled so cruelly, but that it worked. He shaped his country, not with ideas, but with obsession. And obsession, when crowned, becomes contagious. He was not a mistake of monarchy. He was its mirror. So, the next time someone says kings are chosen by God, remember Ferdinand. And pray God never chooses again.